Uh, Good afternoon all. Welcome to AATCM, the Emergency Medicine Channel. As said before, we will be doing the panel discussion on severe COVID-19 infection. We have our expert team here. Myself, Dr. Srishant TP. I am working as a consultant emergency medicine. I will be the moderator for the session. And we have Deepu PS. He is actually a consultant and associate professor, Department of Infectious Diseases. And we have our beloved Girish sir, you all are familiar with, and he is our HOD and Professor of Emergency Medicine and Critical Care. And my colleague Shabrish, Dr. Shabrish here, who has been managing the critical care ill patients for the last 1.5 years. And I would say that what is our experience in the last 1.5 years, we have approximately managed 5,000 COVID-19 patients. And among that, nearly 500 to 600 severe COVID ill patients we have managed for the last 1.5 years. And so we have a lot of difference from the wave 1 and wave 2. So wave 1 we were managing somewhere other, has been in Kerala. We are not much affected in wave 1, but wave 2 we have a lot of severely ill COVID-19 patients coming in. So a thought arose between us that why can't we have a panel discussion on COVID-19? Whatever experience we had, we will share with our audience. So this is how it turned up. So I request the audience, what all questions we have, you can just put it in the chat box, the live chat box, and we'll be able to answer it maybe after initial 20 to 30 minutes of our initial discussion. So I had made few questions ready for our expert panel. So we'll just start with Giri sir. Sir, when do you say exactly the patient has got a severe COVID-19?
Okay. So if you see COVID-19 as an infection, viral infection, we'll be seeing many types of viral infection like H1N1, COVID, dengue, so many cases we are dealing every day. If you see the COVID-19 alone, that COVID-19 we can divide into, the severe cases can be divided into critically ill COVID and severe COVID. Severe COVID, we know that mainly it affects our respiratory system. So respiratory, one of the most important feature of any respiratory distress is tachypnea. This is the one thing most of our residents forget about, that basics. So tachypnea is one of the most important condition which can define it as a severe COVID, because more than 30 respiratory rate should be come under severe COVID. And desaturation, we all know that comparing to other respiratory diseases, here desaturation is there, but patient is fully stable. The type of like fully stable hypoxemia. Here the problem is, most of the time when we see a case of respiratory distress, since they have clinical features, we will be very careful. The doctor or EMT or staff will be very careful. But in COVID-19, whereas in COVID-19, the respiratory distress is there, desaturation is there, but patient is fully stable. That creates some confusion among healthcare professionals. That is definitely it is there. So that creates so many unwanted things like shifting the patient during shifting patient. Normally when the patient is sick, tachypnea and hypoxemia, we are very careful. But here that carelessness has come because when a inexperienced staff see the patient, he is fully stable. So while shifting, so many unwanted complications can occur. So basically when we are talking about severe COVID means tachypnea, desaturation, and if you take an X-ray, bilateral infiltrates, all these things are severe. But whereas in critically ill, that is a different entity. Critically ill means somebody is having a chronic diabetes, uncontrolled diabetes, DKA, who is having COVID. He has become critically ill. He does not have a respiratory problem, but some other problems are there. Somebody is having cardiac disease, critically ill. So all these things we should take into consideration, not just COVID with associated condition, COVID alone with respiratory problem. These are the two important entities in when we are dealing with COVID.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. So next I will be asking to Deepu. Is there any warning sign to say that the patient with mild or moderate symptoms can worsen into severe disease?
That's a very relevant question.
Please.
That's a very relevant question. So, thing is, why that question? The importance of that question is, we know that in this COVID pandemic, 80 to 90% of the COVID patients who are having COVID-19 disease is falling under mild category. Only 10% is really requiring hospitalization. Since like there is no other way, we have to promote home quarantine, because otherwise we will be overwhelming our healthcare systems. So since we are promoting the home quarantine, there has to be some kind of mechanism, some kind of red flag signs which we can identify when they call us, so that we can tell that, okay, your condition is not remaining stable, you might require a hospitalization. So we need to be familiar. So that is the premise of that question, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so one thing we of course in the Kerala state guidelines, if we are looking, there is categorization into A, B, C. A usually the mild symptoms, B with underlying comorbid conditions, and C basically children with conditions like convulsions and seizures, so or even severe disease. So this is the broad classification. Even if we not remember exactly what all are the parameters which is defining A, B and C, we need to have a gross understanding regarding the basis of classification and when a patient requires a tertiary care hospitalization. For example, if a patient, as we know, as Girish sir pointed out, it is a respiratory system disease. Usually the patient will have upper respiratory symptom or lower respiratory symptom. The patient will have fever, the patient will have cough. Especially the fever and cough mostly will be pronounced during the onset of the disease. And with progression of time, with passage of time, the symptoms has to come down. But in case if the symptoms are not coming down, if the symptoms are getting worsened, then that itself is a red flag sign. If the patient is having a persistent fever more than 5 days, then that is a red flag sign. It has to alert that something is not going in the normal way. There is something which is brooding. Or if the patient is having progression of the symptoms. For example, if the patient had cough at the onset, but after some time the cough is progressively worsening. The patient had breathlessness. Now the breathlessness increased so much that even in exertion he is developing breathlessness, or even at rest he is developing breathlessness. So exertional breathlessness, exertional dyspnea, these things has to alert us. Also sometimes there might be atypical features which may not be completely in line with the COVID pneumonia. For example, the patient can have chest pain, or the patient can have weakness of one limb. So because the COVID can predispose for development of other system involvement. So if he or she is getting some other symptoms or signs which is not classical of COVID pneumonia, that also has to alert us. So basically, to conclude, I will tell if there is a progression of symptom, or after an initial recovery, if the patient is developing again the patient is developing symptom, or then worsening of the existing symptom, persistence of the symptom, and then involvement of symptoms suggestive of involvement of other organ system. These things, even if it is not falling into ABC category, these should alert us. And of course, we need to give special care to those group of individuals who have underlying comorbidities.
Okay, thank you, Dilip. Thanks a lot. Next question we need to submit, which is very pertinent to our present system of the triaging policy. So can you just elaborate the triaging policy that has been used since the last 1.5 years in our center?
Okay. Thanks, Krishna. So one thing, if you all remember, compared to the first wave, there is a significant change in the definition of the case itself. So there was a lot of importance we were giving to the travel history before. So that was kind of complicating our triage process in the first wave. So you had any patient who has traveled 14 days in an endemic area coming. So once that was cleared, and now it is more of like symptoms and the test positivity, things are a little bit easier. That said, coming to our institutional, what we have done, luck, or people can call it just mere luck. We were at the beginning of the wave, we were commissioning the new ER. So once the new ER was commissioned, we converted the old ER into a COVID specific ER, and the new ER turned into the non-COVID ER. So currently what we follow is, we have the rapid antigen test which we are doing at the entrance of the ER itself. That's the common entrance of the ER. Any patient who is coming in gets our other protocol for resuscitation and severity of the presentation is happening, but COVID specific triaging I'm focusing. So any patient who is stable at the ER door undergoes a rapid antigen test. If the patient is positive for rapid antigen test, the patient directly moves to the COVID ER. So suppose there is another group of patients who will have symptoms. So any respiratory symptoms which could turn out to be COVID, they will go to the mixed area, or an area which is in the COVID unit, but we will wait for away from the main ER. We'll go to the COVID unit in the quarantine bar mixed area, where the patient will undergo a PCR test, a NAT test. Okay, now the other patients will come to the common ER. From there also, before admission to the hospital, all patients will undergo a NAT test, which could be a TrueNAT or a PCR or a gene expert based upon the emergency of the case. Now, the level of protection at the common ER also, all staff are maintaining a level 2 PPE protection, and the level 3 is being practiced at the COVID specific ER. I think that kind of clarifies what we are following at this point. That is definitely the two things. One is the availability of rapid antigen test at the doorside itself, and the level of protection all the staff are following.
So we were able to mixing of patient. We could to very great extent
Yeah.
we could prevent that in the last 1.5 years.
Yeah,
That is
but-
one of the great things that has happened because it was
yeah.
sudden. It was not a sudden surge of patients. We had time to prepare ourselves. That helped us really well.
But that said, we can have exceptions. Like a patient coming to the common ER itself can turn out to be without any respiratory symptoms. Also, we are having patients, as you all know, all of you might be experiencing also. Some patients will turn out to be positive in the common ER also, but that we have to deal with.
And also the resuscitation, a separate resuscitation unit was also planned for the COVID specific patients
Yes, yes.
already who are having respiratory symptoms. So that helped us. Thank you,
Yeah,
Shabri, for
yeah.
that insight. And request to the audience, if you have any questions, just put it in your chat box. Whatever be the things, we'll be trying to answer after the preliminary discussion. So we have got some 15 questions with me. We have covered 3 questions. Next will be to the Giri sir. Sir, what are the precautions that you need to take while you transport a COVID positive patient from ER to COVID unit?
Okay. As you know that most of the EMTs or staff in ER are experienced in managing respiratory cases. But when we take COVID, there is high level of errors can occur in COVID transportation. That is because if you see the case, COVID case, he may be desaturating, but he is fully stable. So if you see only the patient, you can make mistake. Only an experienced EMT or an experienced staff nurse can pick up that problem now. What happened is during the second COVID wave, many of our staff members had COVID. The number of staffs have come down drastically. Experienced staff have come down drastically. Then what remained was newer staff or new inexperienced staff. They actually are prone to develop a lot of mistakes during their transportation. So that should be corrected. Every time when we take a COVID case, we have to guide them. Actually, a senior person has to guide them. But unfortunately, many centers in India, there were no senior staff during this surge of COVID. So that was really a problem even for us. Even then, when we are transporting, we have to take certain precautions. So when the patient come to ER or directly to COVID area, when we see the patient will be fully stable. But if we see the saturation, it will be low. So while transportation, normally when the patient is sick, when we remove from the oxygen, they will become immediately symptomatic. They will tell, I need oxygen, or they show some signs of hypoxemia. But these patients will not show. So if you shift from ambulance or somewhere to a bed without oxygenation, suddenly patient can deteriorate. So that we should keep in mind that this patient anytime can deteriorate while transportation. So we have to take our steps for that. We have to avoid such situations. And many pulse oximeters, what is available now, they are not very standardized. I am not telling they are substandard. They are not standardized. So that also can create some problem during transportation. And availability of bed. There is a third thing. So many hospitals now, all ICU beds are full. These hypoxemic patients are actually going to ward because there is no bed in the ICU or HDU. So from there, patient can suddenly deteriorate. Again, the number of staffs comparing to pre-COVID era is less. Experienced staffs are less. So all these things are created problem. But even then, our country, we managed better than any other country because we have experience in handling mass emergencies. Like large number of cases we used to manage. That experience has counted. It has created a good protocol now also. But even then, we are not able to do like pre-COVID era. That is because of our limitations. But even then, when we are transporting these cases, we have to take care. We have to alarm the surrounding area. When we are transporting a COVID positive patient through a regular, we can only transport through the regular way only. We cannot create a new green area for COVID transfer. So when we are transporting, we have to make sure that no one else is coming towards the patient, near to the patient. We have to, we have a COVID pot. It is covered pot. In that we keep the patient, we transport in that COVID pot. While transporting, we spray antiviral on the surrounding area. It may not be 100% scientific to spray the surrounding area with the antiviral, but some protection it can give and some awareness it creates among the people around. That's all. We cannot 100% protect from virus. But people who are seeing, they know that something is happening, so they'll keep away from the patient. That's all. And while transportation, we should take more care comparing to other patient, because anytime this patient can desaturate and become bad.
Right.
So that should be taken care.
Okay, thank you, sir. And also a separate lift was maintained
Yes.
for transportation of COVID positive patient.
Yes.
That also helped us a lot in preventing the infection. So the people will ask why to spray, because it will again, as I said, it create a lot of awareness.
Awareness, that's all.
At least that area becomes sanitized once time. There is no issue in sanitizing that area.
Yes.
So that awareness has created. Thank you, sir. Now we have question to Sabrish. What are the oxygenation strategies that you follow in a hypoxic patient other than mechanical ventilation? We all know regarding mechanical ventilation. And what should be the target level of O2 that you will aim? So when you look at the guidelines, post resuscitation maintain 95 to 99%. So what are the changes that have come up in COVID? Can you just elaborate?
Sure. Some of the core principles of oxygenation remain the same. So we have, other than the ventilator, we have your nasal prongs, which we keep over the nose and give oxygen. We have the face mask, we have the Venturi mask, and your high flow oxygen and the non-invasive ventilation techniques. So the usual norms which we follow for our nasal prongs of 2 to 4 liters, yes. Once initially we give 2 to 4 liters. If it is beyond that, we move on to a normal oxygen mask where we give up to 8 to 10 liters. And if it is beyond 8 liters, then we usually move on to the NRBM, non-rebreathing mask, where we give up to 10 to 15 liters. In our center, we are not practicing much of Venturi mask, so I will skip that. And then if that is also not being enough to maintain the saturations, we move on to the NIV. NIV, again, the traditional, you have the BiPAPs which deliver oxygen from the flow meter, and then you have the high pressure kind of, you fix it to the central oxygen thing. So the conventional BiPAPs, yes, the oxygen delivery is not very much guaranteed, so we have to keep that in mind once you're keeping the patient on a conventional missions like your A40 or the Stella missions. But the real NIVs which we use in our center is a brand called as V60 from Philips, which we can guarantee an oxygenation of close to 100%. So once you say NIV or BiPAP, make sure that what you are meaning by it. A machine like a V60 and all, it's designed for management of hypoxemia, while as the other machines are predominantly designed for your COPD and home care and things like that. So that clarity we have to have. And the second part of the question which you asked is the target. The recommended targets are close to 92 to 94%. But that said, the one of the things which I feel many a times we get referral letters and all. The problem is people blow out the oxygen and keep it at 98% targets. So one thing, the oxygen scarcity part, that is there, but there is no point in just oversaturating the patient at these situations. So keeping a saturation of 10 liters to maintain a saturation of say 98 doesn't make much sense at this situation. We can always go for a target saturation of close to 92 to 94. There are situations where we have kept patients with a target of 90% without much issues, and we have discharged those patients home. So key thing to remember is that don't blow out the oxygen to keep very high saturations. Anything close to 92 plus or minus 2 should be okay at this pandemic cover. And moving on to the first part, I just missed one point. High flow oxygens.
I was about to ask.
Yeah, high flow nasal cannulas. Yes, there is definitely a role of high flow nasal cannulas in hypoxemia correction. But again, the consumption of oxygen with high flow nasal cannula is very high. We will end up using close to 60 liters per minute and all. So again, in a pandemic situation where the oxygen availability is under question, we have decided of late not to opt for high flow oxygen machines as we had used in the first wave.
Okay.
I think I covered all points, right?
You.
Okay.
And next, I will come to you. It's one of the common thing is that when you have a COVID, you need to do a CT scan. So many people used to call us and ask. Each one will have that experience. That why not we take a CT scan in COVID? So next question: what is the role of CT in COVID?
Okay, thank you. That's a very relevant question. One thing we need to clearly understand is that even if you are looking at ICMR guideline or Kerala state guideline, the severity classification is based on two things. One is respiratory rate, another is saturation. So basically it is a clinical severity classification. Anyone with a respiratory rate of more than 30 and saturation of less than 90 is a severe COVID pneumonia. Anyone with a respiratory rate of less than 24 and a saturation of more than 95 or more is a mild. In between, it is moderate severity classification. So we really don't need an imaging to decide on the severity of the disease. Why you want to know the severity of the disease? Because the treatment of a patient is based upon the severity of the disease. For example, if it is a mild disease, we usually give ivermectin or vitamin C, Syncovit. So those smaller regimens would be enough for a patient who has mild disease, who are in home quarantine. But for severe disease or moderate disease, we will go for more expensive treatment and more potent treatment like antiviral agents with more potent activity like remdesivir, and because of hypoxia we will give steroid. So since the regimen change based upon the severity of the disease, understanding the severity of the disease has a significant role. But then as I said, it is basically a clinical decision. So now what is the role of imaging? So since it is not a imaging based decision to give the treatment, the role of imaging is always adjunct. So it is a adjunct to the for severity classification. So basically from chest x-ray itself we will able to know the severity of the disease, but the problem is that being a viral pneumonia, it will be mainly interstitial shadows. So viral pneumonia may not pick it up as much as CT scan. So that is the limitation of viral pneumonia, it may underplay. So in order to prognosticate radiologically, and also one thing which CT scan can better do is that once we do the CT scan, it will give us a quantification of the involvement of the parenchyma. So depending upon the involvement, there is a gradation in CT, mild, moderate and severe. Less than 8, then it is mild, 8 to 15 it is moderate, more than 15 it is severe. So a radiological quantification of the involvement of the lung parenchyma is available in CT. So this will really help us to prognosticate, and this will also help us to communicate to the family, because the patients may not always understand that if we are telling that oxygen is a little less or respiratory rate is a little high. But for us primary care physicians, for us that will make much more sense. But for patient communication, definitely the CT helps, because there is an objective score which we can communicate to the patient, and we can objectively tell that this much amount of the lung, and we can always tell that because of this much involvement, definitely there is a likelihood of progression to the disease. So that is one thing CT can do. So, and we would not suggest, or even in our institute we are not doing CT on a regular basis, but anyone who is having borderline saturation or hypoxia, that is the group which we usually do, or sometimes with persistent cough, just to have a gross understanding of the lung pathology of the lung, we does a CT test. So that is second thing. Third thing is that, like after a initial improvement, if the patient is worsening, or if there is a progressive worsening of the initial clinical symptom, then that is one time where all should do CT test, because CT test can give a better idea regarding what is happening. Maybe after initial improvement, if the patient is worsening, as we already discussed, as we all know that in a hypoxic patient we have to give steroids. So there is always a possibility of secondary superinfection. So if there is a fungal infection or bacterial infection, those kind of radiological picture can be picked up by CT scan. So that can change the treatment regimen which we are going to give to the treatment. So that is one area CT will really help. Of course, sometimes we may not able to do a CT plain chest. For example, if there is a rapid deterioration, which may not be explainable by a secondary superinfection, in which scenario we will think of something like pneumothorax or pulmonary embolism. So in which case we have to do a CT with contrast, which can identify CTPA, in which case our treatment will be purely on anticoagulation. So these are some things.
Can I just add on something? I think Deepu will also agree, because the CT, we have taken CTs on patients on the verge of discharge just because the X-ray is still remaining bad, and we get a score of like 23, 24 out of 25. But the patient is clinically not that sick. And it's on the day of discharge, we had at least a couple of patients we can quote offhand itself. And so the key thing is there is definitely a clinical radiological dissociation or discordance, because it need not always match. At the same time, when we are taking a CT at an earlier phase, Deepu has covered all points, but I would be more worried if I get a plain CT in a patient who is severely sick. Probably a contrast study or a CT pulmonary angio at an earlier phase, because that's what I was trying to convey is that early phase patient is sick, but a normal CT is going to worry me really bad, really.
And one more question that I like to add on the perspective of CT is that there are centers where I have heard, I am not very sure, that they diagnose COVID with CT. Like antigen is negative, PCR multiple test is negative, but they just took a CT and say that it is COVID and they are treating as COVID-19. So what would be your take on that?
Okay, so my take will be like this. For example, CT is a radiological imaging. So we know that the effect of COVID, for example, Dr. Sabri just now told that at that verge of discharge, if you are doing a CT, we can get a CT with high CT severity score. So if we are following upon this patient with progressive CT, the CT findings will going to remain there for at least a particular period of time. So the patient might come to us post discharge, and if you are doing a CT, the CT will still show the changes. So that does not correspond to an active infection. Why are we actually, we need to pick up the active infection, because it always has the potential, it has a public health perspective, it has the potential to spread from one patient to another. Whereas, you know, like what from imaging we can decipher is that definitely the patient had COVID, has COVID. So we don't know whether it is a has COVID or had COVID, and we don't know whether if it is a had COVID kind of situation, then it does not mean much to isolate that patient. It will be a utilization of the resources. So CT as a triage should not be a first step, but it should be a add-on step.
Again, like H1N1 pneumonia, which is similar picture like COVID. Can they have similar CT findings, interstitial pneumonias?
Yes, that is also a very important confirmatory factor.
Thank you for that answer. Sir, next to Giri sir. Sir, what is the basic principle behind proning and hypoxia?
So when we learned in MBBS, we know that maximum surface area of your lung is on the posterior aspect, and only small area is in the anterior aspect. So when we are lying down or straight, only a few area is exposed for air, and the movement is only anterior posterior, and back is not moving. So when we have a pneumonia where the lung parenchyma is reduced, we ask the patient to prone. That means in the prone position, when they keep, the lung movement will be better comparing to when you are lying down normally. But if you see the guideline, 16 hours we have to prone. That is not practical for any human being. So what we have to tell the patient is, whatever position they are comfortable, they should lie down on that position. So for example, half an hour on right lateral, half an hour on left lateral, half an hour proning position, half an hour other position, then sit up. So this will create that monotonous way of lying down will be avoided, and patient will be more comfortable. So proning as such is very good. It improves the lung aeration, but we have to understand the patient's difficulty also. They will not be able to do. When somebody is having cardiac failure, pneumothorax, all these fellows will not be able to prone at all. So we have to be very careful. We have to tell them whatever position they are comfortable, they should do that position, and we should tell the patient that proning is better. So many patients, when they call our phone, we tell them to keep in prone position so that their aeration will improve, the saturation will improve. Definitely it is going to improve, but the position of proning is not very comfortable for a patient who is having cough, breathlessness and all. So right lateral position, left lateral position, all these things have similar effect of proning. But somebody is on ventilator, then that is like easy for a doctor or a healthcare professional to keep the patient in proning. But awake proning is a good thing, very useful, improves the saturation, but difficult to practice for a patient. Their comfortable position is always better. But we should guide them, we should tell them this is a good position, so that they'll keep it.
Sir, and again the question, the resuscitation, because in ICU, a lot of will be prone to develop a cardiac arrest. So the patient is on a prone position. Can we go ahead with the resuscitation?
Definitely, we have to do it. During that time, we should not turn the patient back and start CPR. We should keep it the same position and do CPR. Continue CPR on prone position itself.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, sir. We already have a dedicated video on
that. We have done a video on that.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Again, audience, we are receiving your questions. So we'll just go through the discussion and we'll come to each question in detail. So we have few comments. We have seen that. Just bear with us for a few minutes and we'll come back to you. Okay. Now to Sabarish, what are the key things to remember while intubating a COVID-19 patient?
Okay. This again, there is a lot of lessons from our first wave and the way we are practicing things now. If you remember, during the first wave, we had the intubation boxes, and there was a lot of hesitancies.
Video laryngoscopy.
And a lot of hesitancies also to intubate, and so things like that. From there, I think that as health professionals, we are also have gained a lot of confidence by seeing a lot of patients, and that fear factor definitely has come down. But I would say, though fear is down, we have to be all cautious. That remains same. So definitely we are not practicing the intubation box as we stay now. If you go by the global recommendations, ideally intubation, the ideal situation would be to have a negative pressure room where intubation is happening. But that is not feasible or practical in our country or most of the places. So that said, then what are the precautions we need to take? Yes, laryngoscope, video laryngoscope is one of the recommendations, and the advantage of using a video laryngoscope is that your contact or the distance between you and the patient is can be longer compared to the conventional laryngoscope. But again, there is a lot of papers which kind of does not support this thought, because the key thing to remember is that the person who is intubating has to be an experienced person. The apnea time has to be as low as possible, and it should be ideally a first shot intubation as much as possible. So a senior hand, whatever method, video laryngoscope or a conventional laryngoscope which he is comfortable in, with a minimum apnea time, that should be the key principles which should be guiding intubation in a COVID patient. Yes, during intubation, you follow your standard rapid sequence intubation technique. Pre-oxygenation, yes, the patient is coughing, probably coughing during the peri-intubation time. Those kind of things you have to keep in mind. So you paralyze the patient with adequate paralysis only. You are going to do a scopy, not like your half sedation without adequate paralysis. Never attempted intubation. Give adequate paralytics, and then once the patient is calm only, you go ahead with your intubation. Yeah, between the video laryngoscope and your conventional laryngoscope, according to the person's competence and the level of comfort, I would suggest either is good enough. And post-intubation care, I think we are coming back to that question probably. So at this point, that's all I would say.
Decrease the contact time.
Yeah, decrease the contact time as much as possible.
Normal laryngoscope, he is experienced.
Yeah,
Just go ahead with that.
True.
And most of the doctors and healthcare professionals are by this time they are COVID positive and negative. So nothing to worry about COVID becoming positive in these healthcare professionals.
And vaccination.
And vaccination also, yes, probably that would have given us more confidence.
Yes.
True.
So it's a separate thing that we are doing now. We are more confident in managing the second wave. Okay, thank you, Shabrish, for that. And now coming back to Vibu, and now the most important thing, what are the key laboratory parameters to follow in severe COVID patients, and what is the role of IL-6, D-dimer and ferritin? These are the lot of theories that we have read, and we'll always does the normal blood count, CRPs. So now to specific for the IL-6, D-dimer and ferritin, can you share your experience and the available evidences?
Yeah. So I think we need to have a bit more clarity regarding the investigations which we could do in COVID situation. It is not about any particular investigation. It is just about the mechanism and why we are doing this investigation. So if we are looking at the basic pathophysiology, then we know that there is a COVID pneumonia, the virus multiplying inside the lung, and as a response our body is reacting, and as a consequence to the reaction, not only the our immunity is attacking the viral cells, but there will be always some cross damage to the normal cells, and because of this continuous virus as well as host interaction, there will be an inflammatory process, ongoing inflammatory process, and as far as possible this inflammatory process has to be limited to the lung, but in real scenario it may not be always like that. The inflammatory process, even though it is happening in the lung, there will be always spread over to the systemic circulation. So the inflammatory milieu, which is actually suggestive of the ongoing process, ongoing pathophysiologic process of the lung, that inflammatory milieu will always get spread or will get mixed up with the systemic circulation. So because of which we can always figure out some markers which could reflect the underlying inflammatory process. So what are the markers which could reflect the underlying inflammatory process? So that is what we are looking at. We are not specifically looking at a single marker. So if we are looking at a combination of markers which could give us a clue that the inflammatory process is really on the higher side, or inflammatory process is kind of subdued. So the inflammatory markers which we commonly look at are CRP, LDH, ferritin, D-dimer. So all these things will give us a clue regarding the extent of inflammation going on. Why we need to understand the extent of inflammation? Because there is something called cytokine storm. It may not always happen, but when this inflammatory milieu is when this inflammatory milieu gets out of control, then because of the inflammatory process itself, the other organ system can also get involved. So we need to have an understanding that okay, this patient might progress to this cytokine storm, or in other words can progress to multi-organ dysfunction because of the COVID worsening. So that if you are looking at these inflammatory markers, this could give us a clue. And why specifically IL-6? I don't think IL-6 has any role, to be very frank. We used to check IL-6 in the initial first wave, because at that time Kerala state guidelines told IL-6 if more than 40 you can give tocilizumab, but right now even in recovery trial they have used only CRP more than 75 as a marker for giving tocilizumab. So even if you are giving tocilizumab or even if you are giving steroids, the basic idea is to control the inflammatory process which is ongoing. So right now we just cannot give tocilizumab based on the IL-6 or CRP. We have to start with steroid, and then rather than taking a decision on a single time point, it would be better to serially monitor the inflammatory markers, and not only the inflammatory markers, also check the other vitals like renal, liver. So if there is a renal dysfunction and liver dysfunction coupled with an elevation in inflammatory markers, then that give you a more clarity regarding the progression of the disease, in which case that if you are already giving the steroid, that steroid alone is not working. So in that particular point of time you add another agent to reduce the gross inflammation like tocilizumab or even baricitinib.
Oh, thank you. Now to Girish sir, one thing which has been proven to be effective in management of severe COVID-19 is steroids.
Yes.
And how does it help? Dose and which steroid use?
Okay.
I think we'll be answering few questions on this, but what I have just gone through the few questions, whether it is Dexa versus Mezaitrone.
Okay.
So can you? just
So,
share your experience?
when we treat any viral infection, we should know two important things. One is virus as such infecting the body and creating some problem. Second thing is the antibodies produced against virus which is attacking our body. Both are happening in viral disease. But when our immune system is good, most of the time we can control the infection without any drug or without any steroid. But what happens is in some patients there will be a dysregulation of immunity. Dysregulation means that either it is overactivated or it is dysregulated activated. In that condition, steroids are really helpful. What we thought previously was steroids are not good in viral diseases, but after H1N1 many know that steroid can be used. What steroid? That is the second question. And what is a dose? The problem with steroid is the high dose of steroids are given for all these viral infection nowadays, like dexamethasone 18 milligram, 25 milligram, that they are not required. A small dose of steroid just to control the dysregulation is enough. Maybe 6 to 8 milligram may be enough, or 4 milligram will be enough. Dexamethasone is an ideal drug because it has got a lot of advantages. It will not produce fluid retention. So such advantages are there for dexamethasone. But if you are not giving dexamethasone, we can give any other steroid which is equivalent to dexamethasone, around 6 milligram. That equivalent doses can be given. But unfortunately, what is happening is, without seeing all these things, people think that steroid is the treatment for COVID and given very high dose of steroid. Unfortunately, that has created some problem, especially those who are having diabetes. The diabetes will become uncontrollable, and slowly patient develops fungal infection, including mucormycosis or other types of fungal infections. So we should avoid that. A small dose of steroid like 6 milligram dexamethasone per day. And one more important thing is, in dexamethasone, when we are giving as an anti-inflammatory drug, it should be given as only single dose morning time. But what is happening is, dexamethasone 4 milligram TID is given. That will reduce the natural response of steroid production. So that also should be avoided. We give 4 milligram or 6 milligram dexamethasone morning dose. That will be more than enough in most of the cases. If the immune regulation is uncontrolled, we have to go for some other way of treating, because the steroid is it attacks the immune system in a wide way, not in a specific way. We have to use specific drugs, or specific treatment protocols are available. That should be used. Steroid can be used initial phase for up to 10 days we can give. There is no need to continue the steroid for longer period, and TID dose should be avoided. Single dose is best. Small dose steroids are best.
Preferable agent is dexamethasone.
Dexamethasone is preferable agent. Cost is very low, fluid retention is low. Such advantages are there, but comparing with other steroids, it has got more potential.
Thank you, sir.
Indication, and just to add on, indication we usually follow it for hypoxemic patients, not every patient.
Not every
Not
patient.
every patient. So every patient that is getting into a COVID ward will not be on dexamethasone.
Dexamethasone should not be on.
Be given on dexamethasone. Only for hypoxemic patients will be prescribing dexamethasone.
Yeah, that's IV, parenteral.
Parenteral.
Yeah,
Okay.
and the role of inhaled budesonide is also there at home. Even home care, there is certain recommendations. Predominantly, patients who are having cough and all, there is some recommendation
Some
for
recommendation.
800 micrograms of Budecort, the meter dose inhaled twice daily.
Okay, thank you, sir and Sarvesh. And now we'll go to the next, to Sabrish. So when we think of putting a patient on a ventilator with COVID-19, the family is totally, they're totally out of this and they think that they are going to die. So that is a global scenario. So regarding the shortage of ventilator, many places that was the initial phase. Now we have enough ventilators, enough hands are there. So now what will be the key ventilator strategies that you need to think specific to COVID-19?
Krishan, I think it will be, we are all in the learning process, to be very frank. There is a lot of thoughts, there are a lot of school of thoughts on timing of intubation. There is a lot of school of thoughts on the mode of ventilation. There is a lot of school of thoughts even debating the type of ARDS in COVID-19. So I would say it will be too premature to definitively give an answer that this is the right way. I wouldn't venture into that. But definitely there are certain lessons from our experience and from the literature so far available. So one thing is very clear that there are different patients are behaving different way, even within COVID. As the literature shows, there are two types of ARDS. You have the conventional H type of ARDS with the high elastance, and you have the L type phenotype of ARDS, which has the low elastance and the high compliance. So it is the conventional ARDS, which is the H type, which is more of the recruitable lung, okay, or the wet lung, where your recruitment strategies can effectively work. But we are definitely finding a subgroup of patients who don't improve well with your conventional ventilation or the L type of L phenotype of ARDS. So but at the same time, we are all following the classical ARDS net ventilation protocol with a low FiO2, with either a high PEEP or a low high PEEP low FiO2 or a low PEEP high FiO2 strategy based upon the patient subtype. That said, some practical things which we need to remember is that when to intubate. When to intubate, yes, some people are saying very early intubation, which especially with COVID, I am not feeling that will be the right way to go, because most of the patients whom we classify as your severe ARDS with PO2 of less than 100 also, we were able to manage with NIV itself. Okay, so one key thing to remember is your respiratory rate. So if the patient PO2 by FiO2, even if it is less than 100, with a reasonably good compensation by the patient himself to a rate of around 24 and all, probably we are able to pull that subgroup of patients with NIV, what I mentioned earlier as V60 and all advanced NIVs, we are able to pull that patients out without mechanical ventilation. Along with that, if at all the patients are going into a ventilator, you have to remember that these are the subgroup of patients who have been tachypneic for a particular period of time. Their respiratory rates are close to 40-45s when we are venturing into the intubation. And the common mistake most of us do is that you completely paralyze the patient and set the rate to somewhere close to 12 to 14, and your follow-up ABGs are going to end up with the severe PCO2 retention. We end up with an ABG of like 7.0 with PCO2 of hundreds. So remember that the patients are being maintained with a very high respiratory drive and tidal volume and mid ventilation. So once you're intubating those kind of patients, remember that the initial settings should, at least you have to keep in mind in that you have to at least try to match. It's not physiologically, artificially possible to manage that physiological drive. So keep this in mind. And at the same time, we can accept a permissive hypercapnia of close to PCO2 of around 50 to 60s with a pH of 7.2. So those are the key lessons. One, yes, these patients definitely, the timing of intubation, there is a subgroup of patients who will maintain on NIV. That patients may not be intubated early. The patients who are not responding to NIV, say 24 to 48 hours, will need intubation. And immediately post-intubation, you have to remember that the patient can develop PCO2 retention post-intubation, and we should be prepared to manage that.
Maybe the role for continuous ETCO2 monitoring at that
True.
time.
Exactly. That's a very good point, because for two reasons. One is your confirmation of your tube. That itself, ETCO2 has a lot of role, because your conventional auscultation measures may not be feasible at this point. So continuous ETCO2 for confirmation and also maintaining of ventilation is very, very important.
Okay, thank you, Satish, for that. And now coming to Rigu, lot of debates, remdesivir, tocilizumab, bicatizumab, all those things has come. So what are the therapeutic strategy and what are the roles of these drugs? Can you just elaborate?
Yeah. So as we already discussed, for mild patients who are on home quarantine, we need to manage with minimum therapy, vitamin C, zinc, or maybe sometimes ivermectin. Who has a nebulizer, and if they have persistent cough, asthma history, we can give budesonide nebulization. Coming to the hospitalized patient, then here the therapeutics changes a bit. So anyone with hypoxemia, we have to start on steroid. So there is no debate on that, because recovery trial has massive, massive evidence is there. Massive number of people, patients has been recruited into the trial, and it has been proven beyond doubt that there is a mortality benefit. So anyone with hypoxia, so we are underlining the fact which Giri sir already told, with hypoxia, they have to be on steroid. So now the patient is on steroid. And anyone with moderate to severe COVID pneumonia, at least in few trials like ACCT trial, the role of remdesivir has been proven beyond doubt. So remdesivir definitely has a role. Remdesivir definitely has a upper hand compared to other agents like ivermectin or favipiravir. Why? Because there are validated trials in which the remdesivir has been proven to have adequate antiviral activity. Many a trial failed to prove its efficacy in reducing the mortality, but definitely early improvement and reduction in hospital stay has proven beyond doubt. So that has to be possible only because of the antiviral property of the remdesivir. So remdesivir, dexamethasone, and based on the D-dimer value, we can give anticoagulation. So there should not be any doubt, any patient who is hospitalized, these three regimens we have to always give. And now, while the patient on these regimen, now here is the question. While on this regimen, the patient might remain status quo, so we can wait those subgroup of patients, and after a point of time they will start recovering. So that is fine. That group of patients is responding to the existing therapy. But in another group of patients who are on this treatment, they might start to deteriorate, or the oxygen requirement will go up, or even the support system will go up from the oxygen to NIV. So that indicates some kind of deterioration. So the existing regimen is not enough for that subgroup of patients. In this subgroup of patients, we have to consider the additional therapies. Like in Amrita, what we are giving is, okay, we used to give tocilizumab, now there is a shortage, so now we are giving baricitinib. So either we will discuss both tocilizumab as baricitinib as a single entity at this point of time, because both of them are immunomodulators. So just steroid is not alone working, so an add-on immunomodulators might help the subgroup of patients. You can give tocilizumab or you can give baricitinib. Hypoxic patient on steroid, not improving or worsening. This is the subset of patients who we will consider adding one more immunomodulator in the form of baricitinib 4 mg OD, which we started using just a few weeks only, but then we up till now we have used on 10 patients only, but out of which 7 patients recovered. Few patients are still on baricitinib. So we are seeing a promising result. It is a JAK inhibitor. It inhibits both viral multiplication, viral entry into the cell, and also has an immunomodulator property. And
just to add on, we have a question in this regard. Role of bevacizumab.
Bevacizumab we are not really using. That is, I think it is a VEGF, anti-VEGF therapy.
So what we have experience is with
baricitinib and tocilizumab. So like addition of an immunomodulator in this subset of group we have to choose and add on the immunomodulator and see. But one thing we have to clearly remember is that when you add an immunomodulator to an existing regimen, ensure that there is no secondary bacterial infection, ensure that there is no active tuberculosis, so ensure that the patient is not on long-term immunosuppressants. If a patient is already on immunosuppressant, or if the patient is already having a secondary superinfection, then this could be counterproductive. So that also has to be kept in mind.
But would you add an empirical antibiotic or something escalation along with an immunotherapy, or is it?
No empirical antibiotics.
Sir, next to the on line of antibiotics only we have seen research. Sir, what is the role of empirical antibiotics or any antifungal? Because the mucor is coming up. Okay. You want to give empirical antifungal?
Normally, when we are treating viral pneumonias, we never treat with antibiotic. But there is a general thinking that whenever we have a pneumonia, viral pneumonia, bilateral pneumonia, azithromycin should be added. It's a wrong concept that azithromycin is given for every patient. What doctors think is azithromycin has got some anti-inflammatory action in the lungs. It has got a post-antibiotic effect. So it will be a safer antibiotic. But when we see the pathophysiology of viral pneumonia, this will never work. Azithromycin or whatever antibiotic will never work. Unfortunately, in our country, antibiotic does not have any control. Most of the patients who is having viral pneumonia is treated with meropenem, imipenem, cilastatin. So higher antibiotics are misused. So we should never allow that. We should, what we are routinely doing in our center is we do procalcitonin. very good investigation, not very costly. We can get a result in half an hour or 1 hour. We can know whether bacterial infection is growing up or not. Depending on that or clinical scenario, somebody is having cellulitis with COVID, we have to treat the cellulitis. Like that, depending on the clinical scenario, definitely we have to add antibiotic. Otherwise, blindly adding antibiotic to the regime of antiviral is not correct. And antifungal also nowadays many are adding. That will not create any benefit for the patient. We have to clinically see the patient developing some fungal infection, fungal pneumonia, mucormycosis. On that basis, we can start antifungals and see the culture or whatever it is. We can start. Blindly adding antibiotic or antifungal actually create more problem than benefit.
Thank you, sir. Sabrish, next to you. Regarding this is weaning from ventilator. So what will be a strategy in weaning and whether there is any role for early tracheostomy?
Okay, very interesting question. So, as I told, the patients are behaving differently on ventilator. And our institutional protocol as of now, from what we do is post-intubation, if the patient is requiring a high FiO2, we go for a very, very early prawning. So, say post-intubation into 2 hours, the patient is still requiring more than like 90% of FiO2. Immediately we go for a prawning. On ventilator, we prawn, definitely for initial plan is to prawn for 24 hours, but we have extended in cases to 48 hours also. Single setting of prawning to 36 to 48 hours we have done. And after that you reverse, and most of the time by this 48 hours, we are able to bring down on the FiO2 to close to 60 to 55%. So once the patient is immediately made supine, the mild increase in FiO2 is acceptable. Probably the next day, close to around 70% of FiO2 might increase, but then we might give one more session of prawning if the patient is having a severe worsening for 24 more hours. So initial prawning with a second prawning for 24 hours, and if the patient needs to improve, they will improve with this. So this gives us an idea of how things are going. But the problem here is, with this prawning, we are needing to give continuous paralytics. Yeah. So there is a group of patients who might go on for an critical illness neuropathy because of the paralytics we are using and the ventilation techniques we are following. That said, on an institutional level, we have just done one tracheostomy on a COVID patient on day because he was extubated and then found to have neuromuscular weakness probably, and got reintubated, and then on day 21st of the positivity, we have done an early tracheostomy. There are again debates going on for an early tracheostomy. I don't think that is very much needs to be encouraged at this point. Definitely not within 10 days of intubation. Post 10 days, yes, we can consider tracheostomy, and we need not mandate for a negative test. That again is very clear within the guidelines, saying that we need not mandate for a negative test before during tracheostomy, but we do. To be very frank, people do wait for a negativity before doing tracheostomy, but as per guidelines, it's not mandated. Between the tracheostomies, again, there is a debate whether we should go for an open tracheostomy or a percutaneous tracheostomy. That again, the answer ends with, based upon the institutional expertise, definitely we go for a percutaneous bedside tracheostomy because of the arranging of the logistics, and also the degree of aerosolation, everything is going to be little minimal compared to the conventional open tracheostomy. And we at the point of entry, before we dilate, we disconnect the ventilator, and then we go ahead with that. And we don't go for a bronchoscopy guided assisted tracheostomy. We usually go with an ultrasound guidance.
Oh, thank you, Sabrish. Sir, next to Giri sir again. Sir, what is the importance of discussing goals of care early in the management of severe COVID-19? We need to discuss with the family members, brief them.
Okay.
So, what will be your...
Normally, we know that COVID, as now 2 sets of people are there. One is vaccinated people, and another one is not vaccinated young individual. Previous COVID where we know that many were elderly individual, those who are having disease, other comorbidities, used to develop complication. Now what we know is non-vaccinated patient who is not having any complication previously, suddenly becoming they develop pneumonia, bilateral pneumonia, desaturation, death, all these complications are very high. So when we counsel the bystander, we have to tell everything in detail, because it's not like any other viral disease. Viral pneumonia can occur, suddenly patient can develop deep vein thrombosis or thrombus in the lungs. Suddenly patient can deteriorate. A patient who is fully stable suddenly can deteriorate. So all these things which we should explain in detail. And goals, when we are setting, we should have proper guidelines for like all this management. We have proper guidelines, international guidelines are there, standard Indian guidelines are there. Kerala government has given guidelines, everything is there. So we have to go only according to guidelines. We should never deviate from the guidelines when we are treating such pandemic situation. So some doctors treat according to their way of management. That is not correct. We should only follow international guidelines or standard national guidelines. If we do some mistake when we are treating unwanted drugs, if we are using out of guidelines, if it goes wrong, we are responsible. So we should only follow the guidelines. We should tell the bystander we are treating this patient according to national guidelines. That is a correct way of treatment. Otherwise, if, like any other disease, it is like that. But unfortunately, in India, we never try to follow the standard guidelines. But here, strictly, we have to follow the guideline, because anything goes wrong, we are responsible. So follow the guideline, treat properly, and tell the bystander whatever happens, because patient will be fully stable, suddenly patient can deteriorate. We have to counsel the patient properly, bystanders properly.
Thank you. Again, back to the one important question regarding pulse steroid, IVIG, and the newly available, the most exciting one, the cocktail in the management of COVID-19. So, can you just bring your thoughts on it?
Okay. So regarding we'll start with pulse steroids. Pulse steroids, Girish sir already mentioned that pulse steroid is not recommended, period. You should not give pulse steroid because it will be definitely counterproductive. You are just immunosuppressing the patient like anything. And the patient, even if the patient is recovering from the COVID pneumonia, the patient is definitely going to go down with the secondary bacterial and fungal infection. Especially, we know that the condition in which these patients are treated, even in the premium of the hospitals, may not be ideal. It is a compromised situation. Everybody, it is very difficult to practice the infection control aspects, and very difficult to monitor the infection control practices also, because of the PP gears which we are wearing. So in such kind of scenario, we have enough evidence in the form of recovery trial and other trials to tell that 6 mg of dexamethasone is as good as 12 mg of dexamethasone. Then why we want to pulse? So that is my take on that. We should not give, especially in the background of this black fungus and mucormycosis and Kappa, COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis. We don't want more fungal infection in this context. Second is IVIG. IVIG we have used for 4 of the patients. 3 of the patients recovered. There is no control arm, so we cannot really attribute the benefit to IVIG. But one thing we can definitely tell is that, in a subset of patient who is not responding, we can consider this as an option. There is a recent article in BMC ID in which they did a randomized controlled trial, out of which definitely the mortality benefit was proven in the IVIG arm. Problem is that it is too costly a drug. So only in subset of patients who have some kind of immunosuppression and who is already received high dose immunosuppressant and who is having a secondary infection and still progress to still worsening, in this subset of people definitely we can consider IVIG. So IVIG, of course, it is an option. From limited experience we can tell at least some benefit is there, but cost we have to consider. In younger subset who is kind of very much immunosuppressed and still worsening, then it may not be a bad idea to just discuss with the family and see their thought. Cannot be a blanket instruction to give IVIG. Even now we are also not promoting that much because of tocilizumab and baricitinib. And the third question is cocktail. Antibody cocktail we had given only for 2 patients up till now. That is Roche cocktail, imdivamib and caricin. So this cocktail is actually antibody against the spike protein of the virus. 2 different spike protein targets has been targeted, so that the viral entry and viral multiplication will be inhibited. So we know that in a classic COVID pneumonia, classic COVID infection can be divided into 3 phases. First is the initial viral multiplication phase, second is the immune phase, third is the recovery phase. So since it is targeting the virus, we have to give it early in the course of the disease. So that is one point we need to always remember. Second, since it is a monoclonal antibody targeting the viral spike protein, second thing we need to remember is that, not every patient needs this. If a viral multiplication happen, then there is a likelihood of progression to severe disease. Those are the group of patients we need to target. A patient who is on severe immunosuppression, maybe cancer chemotherapy or bone marrow transplantation patient, severe CLD. So these group of the patients, if they develop a severe COVID pneumonia, then it is very unlikely that we will be able to save those patients because of the underlying disease. This group of patients, if we are targeting, there is a possibility that at least a subset of patients is going to improve.
Okay. Thank you for that. Now, coming to the last question to Shabdish. Take on ECMO and other exploratory therapy like inhaled nitric oxide.
Okay, fine.
So we had some experience on this.
Yeah, sure. Regarding ECMO per se, it was more of a policy decision that we, considering the pandemic load and the logistics, we haven't gone for ECMO in COVID. But from the other colleagues who are ECMO experts all over India, the general impression is that the general outcome is close to 25 to 30%. But the key thing with ECMO is that ideally you might need to have an exit plan from the ECMO also. Okay, so and a successful ECMO program will need a lung transplant also. Okay, so there's a subgroup of patients who might end up on a lung transplant. So if you don't have a comprehensive advanced respiratory care plan, venturing into ECMOs might get tricky. That said, there has been 30% is not like a very bad number. There is a subgroup of patients who are getting into early ECMO can have a good outcome, but that is in similar lines to the conventional ARDS ECMO results also. Okay, that's it. Inhaled nitric oxide, again, as our center had a registered trial with DCGI approval for inhaled nitric oxide. And the subgroup of patients who had received inhaled nitric oxide were the patients who were on NIV. So the patients who had on NIV, we had given a BD dose of inhaled nitric oxide for 30 minutes. And the article, probably Deepu can add on a bit on it, but the article is already for a preprint available. The general result we got is that among the 15 patients who had given, none of them had progressed on to ventilator, compared to the control limb where out of the 15, 4 people ended up on a mechanical ventilator. So probably there is some effect, but the jury is out there. And we need to find out the exact subgroup of patients who is going to benefit from INO. We cannot just blankly say that every patient can be given a INO or will benefit from it. Probably Deepu can add a bit on it, on the what is the physiological basis or why we choose that.
Not only INO, but even baricitinib, tocilizumab, INO, all these are adjunct therapies to the existing regimen. So most of the time, this the subgroup which we select for giving this kind of treatment is patient who already on oxygen or progressing on oxygen to NIV. So this is the subgroup we usually target. So if the patient is on mechanical ventilation, then we will never give INO. We occasionally give tocili and bari, but definitely tocili if they are coming to the ICU within first 24 hours. So that is the group. But for INO, the maximum response we have seen in patients who are on NIV in the initial hours of HDU care, who are on oxygen, who are on NIV. Then like when we, as Dr. Shabdish told, when we followed up on this group of patients, definitely the patient who received an INO has two actions. One is antiviral property, second is immunomodulatory property. The patient who has received INO, the progression to mechanical ventilation was very low. So that is something promising. But we have our initial results we have published. The publication process is ongoing. The preprint is there in BMJ. And we are still recruiting more patients because of the initial promising results.
So to conclude that whatever experience that we have, it should be severe COVID, it should be an individualized basis therapy rather than just to give all drugs to everyone.
Yes.
Maybe specifically with tocilizumab, IV, AG, baricitinib, inhaled NO, all this severe COVID should be a patient tailored, and if the patient selection should be very correct. And only one thing that we can assure is that the role of dexamethasone for hypoxemic patient, a low dose of dexamethasone, and maybe remdesivir also for those group of patients. So that will be to conclude. Now we will go to the questions, audience questions. So we have some 20 questions, I guess. So to start with, what is the role of bevacizumab in the cytokine storm, which I think we have already answered. Dexamethasone versus methylpred. Again, it was clear that it should be dexamethasone. Any role of favipiravir?
There are the initial evidence of favipiravir came from a Russian study in which they have proven that 1800 mg, that loading dose is very key, 1800 mg BD of loading dose, followed by, depending upon the weight, 800 mg BD or 600 mg BD for 7 days, total of 7 days can be given. In that particular trial, they have found that the progression, like favipiravir, we are not giving for a moderate disease or for severe disease. During the early disease, or even when there is borderline hypoxemia, that is the time usually you will give favipiravir. Afterwards, as I told, the evidence is maximum for remdesivir. So once the patient is progressing, definitely switch to remdesivir. Favipiravir evidence is kind of mild, but there is evidence. So in mild category of the disease who has comorbidities, we can definitely give favipiravir.
Okay.
I think you can call out the name of the person who has
the question also. So we had answered from Osasigrom, sorry for that spelling, I couldn't read you well. Safi Haidar Saidi, that we have answered. Exona versus Methylpred. Koti Reddy, role of Favipiravir, we have answered. And now coming to Dibanshu, Bavaliminib and Casrivinib used in mild COVID positive. Any role?
Not, we don't have much idea on that.
We don't have any
Casrivimab,
experience?
Imdivimab, that is the Roche cocktail is what we are using.
So again, we don't have experience, and maybe we need to explore.
So, you
that.
know, like whatever it is, you know, there are so many monoclonal antibodies out there which has been approved by FDA. So, you know, depending upon the availability, you might be getting some kind of cocktail. But one thing you have to clearly understand is that it is a monoclonal antibody, target is virus, so give it in the early phase.
Early phase. Thank you. Now we have a question from Shankar Narayan. One dose of steroid given, my patient will responded well, but from day 2 she came down, but I dose given while SpO2 is 90 to 89 without O2. Why? The question is not very clear. First dose of steroid given.
Probably he's asking why his patient deteriorated.
Deteriorated
Probably,
on the
yeah.
second day.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I mean, to be very frank, all patients don't respond. First of all, if you go by recommendation, there was no recommendation to give Dexa for a patient who was not on oxygen. But to be very frank, even with the recommended medicines, we cannot guarantee that all patients are going to improve. There can be multiple factors involved in the disease process itself.
Okay, I hope the answer is clear. Now coming to Dr. Parmesh.
Yeah, so just to add on, you know, like whenever the patient deteriorates after an initial response to steroid, always consider two possibilities. One is secondary infection, second progression of the underlying disease. So that is where the other immunosuppressants will come into the picture, immunomodulators will come into the picture, and always rule out a secondary infection. As are told, procalcitonin, and if you are suspecting fungal, galactomannan. These two biomarkers you can check.
Okay, now coming to Dr. Parmesh Chand, can the injection tocilizumab given after 20 days stay at hospital and patient maintaining saturation around 90 after 20 days?
You know, like the recommendation is like this. If the patient was on 20 days, the patient was hospitalized for 20 days and the patient was in ward, and suddenly the patient deteriorated and the patient came to ICU. We have ruled out a secondary infection. So then that indicates it is a COVID associated inflammatory process. Then there is a role. That being said, classically tocilizumab indication usually will come around just after 1 week and before second week. So that 1 to 2 week is the period where we usually have to use tocilizumab. In this particular scenario where the patient is deteriorating after 20 days, I think there might be some other factors, unlikely to be due to a pure COVID worsening.
Okay. Now we have a question from Varun. Is remdesivir still in use after it being removed from treatment protocol?
Yes, remdesivir is very much in rule because very much there.
Important.
Yeah, because you know, like if you are checking all US guidelines where the maximum evidence and we know that it is the way they do trial is very stringent. So you cannot just ignore a trial coming from US. You know, whatever being said and done, the trial which has been carried out in US comes with a high evidence base. So it is very much there.
Very much in use. Okay, thank you. Now I think Sabrish can answer this. So from a question from Shankar Narayan, patient in BiPAP, how we handle their thirst?
Yeah, of course. By default, for any patient whom we feel require long-term NIV, that is more than 24 hours, we go for an early Ryle's tube itself. So we place in a Ryle's tube, and naturally we will carry on with the thirst. I mean, both nutrition thing with the Ryle's tube. But that said, regarding the basic thirst mechanism of drying of mouth and all, of course, you can wet the lips and tongue with normal water while disconnecting for a transient period of time. That's okay.
Even you can give oral feeds if he is tolerating for some time.
Yes, but that's going to be a little tricky, especially when the patient is requiring high FiO2 and all. Yes, patient with a relatively lower FiO2 who can tolerate connection, what we usually do is that we give a break period of around 1 hour where the patient is given oral feeds, and during that time we go for an NRBM or a mask and they remove it and just have a feed. That's a mild subgroup of patient, but severe hypoxemia, definitely you have to go for a Ryle's tube upfront.
Thank you, sir. Now again we have a question from Varun. What suggests poor prognosis in COVID-19 patients while on treatment and how to manage? What suggests?
Okay, so
I think we have answered in our discussion.
Yeah.
So it's basically the disease progression.
Progression of the disease, age, underlying comorbidities. But you know, these all are classically described. But what we are seeing in this particular wave is that even younger individuals, fully stable, without much comorbidity, are getting sick. But then again, one pattern which we are seeing is most of them are obese. So obesity is also a risk factor. Other than the classical inflammatory markers like ferritin LDH, CK, D-dimer, D-dimer, probably D-dimer elevated patients. That is one subset of patients who are really worsening rapidly. Probably there might be some micro thrombus happening in the pulmonary circulation. In order to prove that, we might have to do some kind of specialized angiogram, which we are unable to do because of the COVID scenario. But then that is a possibility.
Now I think Giri sir can answer this, sir. How to deliver the status of COVID-19 patients on treatment about prognosis to bystanders effectively? I think we have covered. Maybe so to answer this.
Now it is very difficult to tell the prognosis to the bystander, because traditionally we know that when the patient is sick, we know some signs are there. So we can tell this patient is becoming sick. But in COVID-19 second wave, it is very difficult to prognosticate the bystander about the patient, because most of these patients are coming in same fashion, like they have hypoxemia, they have some tachypnea, oxygen requirement is high. Suddenly patient is deteriorating, so we will not be able to prognosticate. Every patient has to we have to tell the same thing to every patient. Suddenly patient can deteriorate, so it will be difficult nowadays. And moreover, the number of staff required for COVID ward manage are high, and all these doctors are not fully trained like an ID doctor. They're all coming from different areas. They are taking their duties. All these things, lot of issues are there in our country, because even in Western countries it's the same. They all are not critical care specialists are doing the duties in the COVID area. All from a different specialty they are coming and taking the duty. So they have some problems. So telling the prognostication to the bystander, no, it is difficult.
Maybe what we can, a single point, same bystander we can brief as we does for all the patient. Maybe we can use.
Okay, whole hospital should go according to a single protocol. Then it will be easy for the resident. So instead of going different consultant, different protocol, it's not practical here because it's a pandemic. We have to go according to a single protocol. Every hospital go according to single protocol. So even bystander know about the protocol, bystander know what are the problems. So then only we can do some justice.
Again, role of antibody cocktail from one moment. I think we have answered it, and our experience we have suggested. And we have one from Kirtana. Any role for follow-up repeat CT thorax?
You touched upon that.
Yeah. We already touched upon that. Definitely, follow-up CT just has a role. For example, we know that not everybody is going to just improve like that. At least a subset of patients are going to develop severe fibrosis. So if you are seeing the regression of the disease process is not very fast, or if the patient is having persistent symptoms, that time you can do the CT, compare with the initial CT, and if required, you can give antifibrotic agents.
Okay, thank you. What type of insulin we should use while giving steroids?
Normally, any patient who is admitted to ICU, whether it is COVID or some other infection, we have to use only short-acting insulin. Because there is a tendency to start higher end insulin in ICU that is not required. You use regular insulin, because regular insulin means we know what is the prediction of the time prediction we know. Half an hour it will act for 6 hours. After that it will come down. So you can use a regular insulin either as a fixed doses like 4-time doses or continuous infusion. That is the best thing. In our ICU we always practice continuous infusion, but in all ICUs it is not practical. So you give small doses. Never start long-acting insulin in any sick patient, because once they go to hypoglycemia, if it is long-acting insulin, continuously they are on hypoglycemia. So it should be avoided. Regular insulin in sick patients are ideal.
And sliding scale again?
Sliding scale, there is no value for sliding scale. You fix the dose. Suppose a patient is coming today, in 24 hours you should understand what is the dose required for this patient. That dose should be split into 4 or 5 times, or continuous infusion should be given. Sliding scale will create problem for an ICU patient.
Okay, thank you, sir. So the next question will be, why some patients are coming back in hospital after discharge with normal markers report, and after readmission these markers are increased? Maybe secondary infections?
Yeah. So the question is not very clear.
Why some patients are coming back to hospital after discharge with normal markers reports, and after readmission these markers are increased?
Okay, so basically I think the question is about long COVID. It is merging into the long COVID. That means the initial COVID wave has subsided. But then coming to the long COVID. So in the long COVID scenario, sometimes there are patient have persistent symptoms.
Yes.
And one of the persistent symptoms is fever. So the patient will come back with the fever. So in this particular time, we have to think of three possibilities. One is reactivation of the virus, which is very, very less likely unless the patient is immunosuppressed. But then, that is a possibility. Whether the patient is a immunosuppressed candidate, we have to think, and then possibility of reinfection we have to consider. Second is secondary infection, which is most common. And third is sometimes just an inflammatory process. Post-inflammatory, post-COVID inflammatory syndrome kind of situation. So post-inflammatory, post-viral inflammatory, secondary infection and reactivation. These are the three things. And depending upon the clinical scenario, assess and decide which exactly the patient is fitting into.
Okay,
Sometimes we have to give steroids for this group of subset.
Subset of patients.
This subset of
Now
patients.
we have a question from Rakhi. When to do inflammatory markers and what are the best markers? I think we have already answered in our session. Kuldeep Kumar, it's a question from him. Is it useful to give patient nintedanib or pirfenidone anti-fibrosis drug in post-COVID lung fibrosis? Some patients have responded well, but don't know it's effective in long term. So,
Idofranib,
and all those
yeah.
drugs.
Yeah, I think
Idofranib and pirfenidone we have been also using, but I think it will be too early to
Comment on it.
say that there is definitive improvement. Yes, we are seeing some kind of early improvement and even hypoxemia
Hypoxia
correction
requirement.
over a week's time, patients coming out of O2 and all. But yes, definitely we are using it. To very confidently say that it is working or not, we will need more time.
More time.
But
it is
definitely.
basically
Yeah,
post-COVID follow-up.
Follow-up.
Yeah.
So that time if there is fibrosis, you can definitely give no much side effects.
Yeah.
So if there is element of fibrosis and if the patient has symptom, then please give.
These drugs are proven drugs.
Yeah.
ILD and all, they are proven
Proven
drugs.
to be have antifibrotic effect.
So again, the question is from Dr. Ashwin. I think we have answered. What is the timing for administration
We
of
answered that
steroids
also.
in COVID? Mary Anthony, we have answered. Vikram Kurup, that's what sir. Can we use Bain circuits as bridge to bypass?
Yeah, there was a lot of interest on vein circuit, especially with social media videos and things like that. Personally, we haven't ventured into that. We had a discussion with our critical care team, but the general input we got was that, as long as we have enough NIVs and other O2 adjuncts, we need not go for that. Yes, it makes some sense. Common sense says that it can have a role in resource-limited settings, especially.
Role of Unilastatin, again from Varun.
Unilastatin,
Started hearing regarding Unilastatin.
Yeah, long back we had used Unilastatin for other
They
conditions.
are not to go for unwanted drugs because we have a standard national guidelines. Our Kerala government has given a guideline. We should always follow these guidelines rather than going for a different type of drugs.
Yeah.
That is always because different doctors are taking duty. They'll not be knowing what is this ulnastatin. If you write ulnastatin, then it will create problem. But if you have a standard protocol, every doctor, every staff nurse should follow that protocol. That is ideal in this situation.
Again.
One more thing I just need to add on to that. Apart from that, exploratory therapies, you follow the normal, regulation as per regulations, as we have given INO and all, you get the necessary approval. So that there can be things which can be useful, but do it in the regulated way.
DCJ.
Yeah, DCJ approval. And
Everybody should know. Institution, everybody should know about this protocol.
Protocols, yes. Again, Dr. Paramesh, I think we have answered. COVID negative, role of tocilizumab, we have answered. Again, from Kuldeep, saturation is 90 post 22 days. Is it because of post-COVID lung fibrosis? Patient needs some time to recover. Please listen to the discussion carefully. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kuldeep, for answering that on behalf. Does nintedanib have a role to prevent pulmonary fibrosis? We have answered. Do the DRDO drug 2DG shows claimed benefits? The group.
Yeah. I think it is too early to tell that the DRDO drug will work. The study is out there, but then the study evidence is not very
Maybe another
strong.
1 or 2 months.
Yeah, we have to use it in real time setting. The mechanism doesn't seem very promising because they are telling that it inhibits the glycolytic pathway and interferes with the energy. But we never know. Let it come.
yeah, and yesterday, there was this webinar, national webinar from Reddy's yesterday, which we also attended. So the key thing is that the people who are using it is seeing some improvement over a course week's time. That the a patient's FiO2, the oxygen requirement is coming down. But as Deepu correctly told, we need more. Even the whatever, there is no significant publication made on this. To be very frank, everything, even the supposedly phase 3 trial is not published yet. It's all news releases. So we have to be cautious. The flip side is that it is not very costly. It comes as a sachet, as you all know, with a very low cost. being involved, relatively low cost being involved, and all adverse effects also not being said. So that's something which we can look into, but to definitely say, I think the evidence is not there.
RCTs, we should definitely have a controlled limb.
Yeah.
The natural course of the disease itself, the hypoxia will come
Yeah,
down.
yeah.
Whether it is due to the drug or due to the, we have just wait and watch. Let's hope for the best.
Yeah.
Now we have again Mithun Reddy, advice regarding post-COVID enhancement of saturation, which is above 1991. Shabrish, can you?
No, there is, as I told, there is no point in super oxygenating the patients. You can accept something close to, your target can be anyway, all recommendations say to aim for close to 94. That's more than enough.
Roll of.
But that said, the caveat will be a patient who is on close to 90-92 can have, the chances of him having an exertional dyspnea will be more compared to his other reserves. Yeah, that we need to keep in mind.
And again, when to do inflammatory marker in one patient, we have answered. Roll of 6-minute walk test. Sir.
6 minutes walk test, what we have found out is very useful, not only in COVID, so many other conditions, being working in emergency room. Most of the time they come for review, these patients come for review. 6 minutes walk test is a very simple, effective, not having any expense. So that test is very useful for patients who can be followed up. When we are following up the patient, the patient will tell that I have breathlessness. But when we do 6 minutes walk test, their saturation is good and it improves even with walking. That means their exercise capacity is good. We can ask them to do more exercise, breathing exercises, incentive spirometry exercises, all these things, they're going to improve. So we can show them there is an evidence that your saturation is improving or it is not coming down. That gives some confidence to the patient also. So 6 minutes walk test is a very useful test, inexpensive, and patient can convince himself that I am improving. Advantages are there.
Okay. Any
Also, one more point I would like to add regarding 6-minute walk test. No? Just like Sir told, during the post-COVID time when the patient come for follow, we can use. Similarly, in home quarantine patient also we can use.
Yes, definitely.
Because sometimes when we used
When to come to hospital.
when to come to hospital, and some because of this pulse oximetry errors. So if it is a true hypoxemia, then you do a 6-minute walk test. Your oxygen should come down because there is an exertion and there is an amount of lung which is already involved. And if the hypoxia is a reflection of the involvement of the lung, then after an exertion, for example, the 6-minute walk test, then the hypoxia should worsen. So that also should give you a clue.
Definitely. Again, Dr. Ashwin has given us a question. Any role for IV or oral methylene blue?
Okay. And I would say we haven't used methylene blue in COVID. We have used methylene blue previously for vasoplegic shock with moderate results. So I think none of us are competent enough to give a definitive answer.
Trials are not very much.
Not very sound at this point.
Experience sharing only we have got.
Yes,
we
more
don't
of
have
that.
any recommendation or RCTs in this regard. Sir, again, this is out of code question. Sir, which books to be read to approach the patient clinically for final year medical student? Please give suggestion.
That will give email or
Okay.
in another video will inform you.
Okay, so I'll request the Raki to put us an email to atcm2018@gmail.com so that we'll give you a detailed review. And we are just discussing regarding COVID right now. So now from another question from Sneha, instead remdesivir, what drug is used nowadays to come out from severe COVID? Remdesivir, still we are using it.
Yeah, still we are using
don't
it.
think,
I think we have already
not
discussed it.
that. Yeah. Ideal timing for weaning to NRBM from NIV.
Yeah, very interesting and relevant question. So what we usually follow is that at least from NRBM, from NIV to NRBM, perfect. So as I told, our protocol will be your advanced BiPAP, that's more like your V60 missions and all. From that, if the patient is requiring a bit of IPAP, EPAP, higher side, we convert them to a normal BiPAP from the V60. So that will be if the patient is requiring less than 50% of FiO2 with probably requiring an IPAP of close to 12 to 14 kind of thing, we convert them to a BiPAP, normal BiPAP with a supplemental oxygen. If we are directly moving on from an advanced BiPAP to an NRBM or mask, that will be probably somewhere close to 40% of FiO2 requirement. Definitely we can match it with something close to 5 to 6 liters. So definitely we will go from weaning from an NIV to mask.
Okay, again we have a question from Mario Anthony. Is there any role of doxycycline and ivermectin in COVID-19? We have already said maybe for mild disease, only for ivermectin there has been proven role. Doxycycline, I don't think we don't have any recommendations as such. Azithromycin, doxycycline, which is more effective. Both are to be said to COVID per se, not to be used as such. the role of anticoagulation in COVID-19. So again, this is a question. A lot of patients, they are inpatient, they are on Clexane, and many of them are at time of discharge, they are put on apixaban, oral anticoagulant. So can you just elaborate? I think we haven't discussed that.
Yeah. So basically, anticoagulation is, as we already told, anticoagulation has a very key role in hospital patients, hospitalized patients, because definitely they're in COVID ward, they are moving around is kind of very low. Even otherwise, even in non-COVID scenario, hospitalized patient, the recommendation is towards giving prophylactic dose of Clexane or low molecular weight heparin. So in COVID scenario, having a preponderance for prothrombotic complication, it would be always better to give a low molecular weight heparin. And also consider the D-dimer value. So D-dimer value is kind of very high, then it would be better even to give therapeutic dose. This is what we are practicing. We have a weight-based D-dimer based nomogram, which we have adopted from the Hematology Society of America. So based on weight-based D-dimer based nomogram, we are giving Clexane. Also, another thing we need to keep in mind is that sometimes when we give Clexane in ICU patients, we are seeing upper GI bleeds. So that we need to keep in mind, and maybe in that subset of patients we have to be very careful, or maybe even we have to withhold. So in severe patients we have to be cautious. Regarding the antiplatelets also, since anyway this question has come, antiplatelet, there is no role to start on antiplatelets, but if whoever is on antiplatelet, the guideline is to continue the antiplatelet. So the subset of patients who are on antiplatelets and we are adding anticoagulants, definitely it is proven beyond doubt it is going to help them from thrombotic complication up till ICU. Once in ICU, the possibility of GI bleed will come in, so you have to be a bit more cautious.
Okay, thank you. So now we have long-standing intubated patient. We have Rajul Karim. Long-standing intubated patient, is tracheostomy helpful for weaning?
And definitely, I think we touched upon it. Definitely, long term, as in with other diseases, you have to go for tracheostomy if the patient is crossing like your 14-day period.
Okay. So again, we have a congratulatory message from Dr. Paramesh. Thank you. Thanks for the guideline. Thank you, Dr. Paramesh. What is the protocol on proning methods in awake patients?
Sir, again, hinted on it. We go for as much as the patient can tolerate. That's the criteria which we are following.
Now we have a question from Mithun Reddy. Thanks for addressing my last question, how to manage exertional dyspnea with SpO2 more than 90 post-COVID. So we are happy with more than 90 SpO2.
Yeah, thanks. He is just telling thanks to you.
No, he's telling how to manage exertional dyspnea in spite of the saturation being more than 90.
So the role of incentive spirometry to improve the functional residual capacity. So all of lung physiotherapy, the role will come in like
more of like rehabilitation kind of thing we need to focus. Probably the other component might also be there of emboli and things like that. So I think that needs to be consulted and then on an individual basis. If it is more of fibrosis, then I would say more of respiratory rehab. If there is a component of distal emboli and all, probably anticoagulation and other things needs to be discussed with the primary consultant.
Recommended medication after 21 days, who is supposed to be discharged. We don't need any medications after 21 days.
No.
Definitely doesn't need any medicines. Unless and until we are treating some of the fibrosis or some post-COVID complications.
Post-COVID, usually the rivaroxaban and antifibrotic agents. These are the two drugs which we usually consider.
Okay, again we have a congratulatory. Dabigatran role effective in moderate COVID.
For hospitalized patient, we prefer subcutaneous heparin. But on discharge, depending if the D-dimer was high, then usually we will give rivaroxaban for a period of 2 weeks.
Again, we have few congratulatory message from Kuldeep and Mario Anthony. And we have one, maybe this will be the last question that we will be taking today from Dr. Sriram Das Hariprasad. What level of IgG says good response after vaccination? 0.8 to my knowledge, they are...
that is based upon whether it is a qualitative or quantitative.
What we heard is above 0.8 we are immune, but as the level increases, more titers we are having.
Yeah. Here, like we are having, I don't know what the exact unit of cutoff. Here the cutoff which we are using is something like 80. 80. What unit I am not sure, but most of the we are conducting a post-vaccination antibody survey and antibody response survey, and in which we are saying that many have antibody response more than 100. So that kind of antibody response, but I am sorry that I don't know the units in which they are measuring, and there are various kits available. So quantitative, qualitative, everything is there. So 80 is kind of the cutoff which we are using here.
So whatever be the reason, you have titers, don't forget to follow your standard precautions.
Yeah, of course, we are getting more COVID positive in vaccinated individuals as well. Definitely, we are not getting severe COVID pneumonia in vaccinated individuals. Even in our ICU, we are getting a reflection of that. The old age people who are vaccinated are not coming back. This is in comparison to the first wave. First wave. This is what we are seeing. So
Wear
definitely,
your mask, sanitize, social distance.
Yeah, so
Yes,
far from the data, it looks like that nobody who had completed 2 doses of vaccine has died in the second wave in our center. But we have lost patients who have just taken 1 dose.
One more question, dose of IVIG. That is a
standard dose,
Standard
yeah.
dose for whatever you
Yeah.
use for GBS
Yeah,
treatment.
GBS
and
over 5
That
days,
is
3 to 5 days.
3 to 5 days. Thank you.
I think
I think we have
We have exceeded,
taken 1.5 hours. It
yeah.
has been an exhaustive session. Thank you all the viewers to staying online and putting us the most valid questions in the discussion. I would thank you, Deepu, to spare this time because as you know, you have been having busy COVID work and you have come and sat here for this 1.5 hour. Thank you. Again, thanks sir, Giri sir and Shabrish once again. And all the viewers once again, thank you. And we'll come back to you with another session which will be useful for you. Thank you.
thank you.
okay, thank you.
Of course,
Sir.
sir.